I'm trying with my talks to archaeology. We love taking pictures of red and white poles on our sites. So there's a feature that we might take a photo of when we have a red and white pole. Now you won't be disappointed. There are red and white poles in this slideshow, but I've tried to broken them up with a few other images. Some of the images I'll show you are reconstruction drawings. There's at least two are world exclusives. No one other than me and the illustrator has seen them before. So there's a couple of world exclusives, but they are of archaeological sites, so don't get too excited. And then I've put in a few images which may have questionable academic quality, shall we say. So we start off with archaeologists, time team. I always put in a photograph of time team. It's almost like the law, really, when you're given a talk that you should put in a photograph of time team. And that's because people are so much more familiar now with archaeology over the last 25, 30 years, partly thanks to time team. Also, to say that time team are very different to archaeologists at Albion and at ULAS or any of the other commercial development units, not least because we can get very dirty, because the conditions we work in, it's British weather, rain and mud, but also our staff are full-time professionals. Most of them have got degrees. They're on Albion full-time contracts. And then the other difference with time team is that we don't pick our sites. In effect, the developer picks the sites for us. So all the sites I'm going to talk about, the only reason we're investigating them is because there's a development taking place, usually at the moment, a housing development. So that's one of the differences between time team and Albion. This is just from the Albion website. We're based in Bedford in a listed building, St Mary's Church. And then the photograph top left of the screen, this one, you'll just be able to make out those archaeologists are in large pits. And I'm going to talk about pit alignments that we've excavated in Leicestershire. But this pit alignment is actually one in Bedfordshire. So you will see that photograph again. In terms of me, here's a really embarrassing picture coming up of me. I'll build it up because I gave a talk in the village I live in last month about my sort of career in archaeology. So I dug out old photographs and things. So this is me on my first ever excavation, aged 14 or 15, I think. In 1979, archaeologists always remember their project codes, and this was called SPK 79, and it's just the site code that you put on your records, put on the finds. I'll get rid of that quickly. And during the 80s, I worked around Britain. I come from down Surrey, Sussex way, which I can't really point at very clearly, but down in the sort of the bottom blob of digs, that's where I worked. I spent time at university in Cardiff, just off the screen to the left, worked around in Essex, got as far north as Cleveland, North Yorkshire now. And then you'll be pleased to know I came to the promised land of Leicester. And I worked on the Shire's excavations at the very end of the 80s. 80, I can't even remember. I guess it was 89. No, 88. End of 88, I think. Worked there. That was great fun. There's some pictures of other people who worked there. I am in the photograph somewhere. And then I lived in Filbert Street East, and I've still got that up in my flat where I live now. To give you a sense of how long my talk is going to take, when a picture of Roman Leicester comes up again, I think that means we're getting towards the end of the talk, just to reassure you. Now, still about me, I'm afraid I am a football fan, and I did live in Filbert Street East, and I did go to some Leicester games, but I'm not a Leicester City fan. I know it's outrageous. You can throw me out. People at home are switching off. But Leicester City are my Premiership football team, but I'm afraid I support a very even bigger team than Leicester City called Wycombe Wanderers. And once upon a time, a lot of years ago, we beat Leicester. And I always said, if I ever gave a talk in Leicester, I'd mention it and then I'd run. So anyway, that's me. So archaeologists, we're passionate about archaeology, but we do have other interests too. And for me, football is one. Back to the archaeology. This just tries to show the main sites that I'll be talking about, I think. So we've done a little bit work in the north of the county at Sileby, and I'll talk about an Iron Age site and a Roman site there. And Helen very kindly at the back of the room has got some of the finds from that site to have a look at. I'll spend a lot of time talking about Great Glen, Manor Farm and Airfield Farm. These are all Roman farmsteads. Manor Farm and Airfield Farm next to Market Harborough have Iron Age components too. Not wishing to let Rutland miss out, I'll talk a little bit about a site at Uppingham that we did where there's a pit alignment. And then I also talk a bit about some of the work at Magna Park. We just did some of the work there. There's obviously been an awful lot more. And as I said, we're only doing these investigations because of developers building on sites. And often we don't report as developer-funded archaeologists direct to the developer. We report and work via their consultant. They have archaeological consultants. So that's RPS Lampro. This is a typical site with excavations underway. So this is actually at Great Glen, just off to the east, on the very eastern side of Great Glen. And you can hopefully make out the big yellow machines, a tiny yellow archaeologist there. I'm sure that person is wearing a hard hat and a yellow vest, I'm sure. And you can see the color, the different colors in the ground. The dark are generally the sort of Roman features, Roman ditches that have become backfilled and Roman pits. The slightly lighter linear features are furrows related to medieval sort of cultivation. And that's a fairly typical open air excavation. It's quite nice because we're fenced off from the active building site. So it's actually a reasonably pleasant place to work. In contrast to sometimes when we're right in the middle of large developments. So this is again on the edge of Market Harborough, a site we know as Airfield Farm, although it is actually next to the airfield rather than on the airfield. And in the middle of that massive construction work is an archaeological excavation underway there. And then I mentioned that there were two sites that I'll talk about a lot near Market Harborough. The other site that we call Manor Farm is located in that area. I'm hoping people at home can see the mouse, or yes, they can. That's good. That's good. Right. So, Big Chief, I Spy, 1966, I Spy archaeology book. Highly recommend it. It's probably the best one, I'd say. And I've put it in here just to say, I sort of wondered when I give these talks whether I should just talk about specific sites, but it seemed as if I'd get a bit repetitive if I did that. So it seemed better to try and give it in a sort of chronological order. The Big Spy, I Spy, obviously things have changed quite a bit. So although some of these terms still exist, and broadly speaking, that chronology stands, some of the dates have changed. We tend not to break the Iron Age up in the way it shows here. We tend to talk about the Middle Bronze Age more. But like the Big Chief, I Spy, my talk is going to end at the end of the Roman period. But there are some finds from post-medieval periods out on display at the back. So my talk's going to go through, starting in prehistoric times, going through to the end of the Roman period. That is the Airfield Farm site again. And it just tries to show that we have all of those features that hopefully you could make out in that earlier aerial photograph. And we try and phase them. We try and decide what chronological period they fit into. So you can see here in purple, there's a linear arrangement of furrows. Underneath it, there's a sort of orange features. They're Roman in date, and the green features are Iron Age in date. This is Manor Farm. Again, I don't know why I'm showing it again. We'll move on. Ah, yes, I remember why. Yes, I remember why. Manor Farm, 6 hectares. We only found 3 features that we think might be Neolithic in date. As someone who tries to be a prehistorian, that's a bit disappointing, really. And when you see them, you're not going to be impressed, but I'm going to show you them because they are the oldest features Albion has found in Leicestershire. Obviously, there's loads of older stuff and more interesting stuff, but I have to show you. I'm waiting for the drum roll. That's it. So that, yeah, wow, they said in the audience, people might not have heard that. Oh, wow. And actually, that's fairly typical of sort of Neolithic, early Bronze Age, small pits. It's maybe 1 meter in diameter, not even half a meter deep. That one contained, the 3 we had contained no pottery. One of them contained a little bit of flint, but it was that undiagnostic stuff that you couldn't really say. But we did get some charred remains, some hazelnuts, some of which were dated to the early Neolithic. So this is a sort of pretty graph trying to pretend we're scientists, and that's the date for archaeologists in the sort of early in the Neolithic. If you think that isn't impressive, I'll show you now the oldest human burial that Albion has found in Leicestershire. There you go, on the left. You may not even recognize it, but archaeologists, field archaeologists would recognize that that's little bits of burnt bone. We wouldn't know whether they're human until they're examined, but they are human. All we can say is that they're of an adult. There were no grave goods. They were radiocarbon dated, and they came through as Middle Bronze Age in date. So these are more recent. This is a more recent person than the person who dug those pits in the Neolithic. And then also of a similar date, again, just by radiocarbon dating, there was quite a long sort of linear feature called a gully on this plan that was found in that excavation area. And the Middle Bronze Age is a sort of time period where we think that land was first being divided for sort of farming and that sort of thing. So it's possible that this gully is part of a field system or something dating to the sort of Middle Bronze Age. And I'll mention that gully, as unexciting as it looks, a little bit later. Also on the outskirts of Market Harborough, the evidence is getting a bit more exciting. Look, this is a bigger pit than that one I showed you earlier. At a site we call Overstone Park, which is on the southeast side of Market Harborough. There's one of these strange areas that archaeologists sort of call burnt mound deposits. So it's an area of charcoal and sort of burnt stones that still survives in the ground in a slight scoop. And on excavation, there was a large pit underneath it. And towards the base, it almost looks sort of trough shaped. And this is a sort of a feature that archaeologists call burnt mounds. And all we have left, because of modern ploughing, is the very base of the burnt mound. It was radiocarbon dated again, because there was no diagnostic finds to the Middle Bronze Age. And the speculation with these, and there was actually one published in the Transactions last year or the year before on a site up at Colville, much better. But this is a similar thing. And it's always speculated about what their function are, whether they're trying to brew alcohol, do something with textiles. But the one I like the most is that they're burning stones to throw into water so that they can have a nice warm bath. I think that's quite a nice idea, to have a sort of sauna. Maybe they don't have them like us every day. Maybe they were having them once a year as part of ritual activities or something. Right. Our staff got a little bit disappointed with the sort of prehistoric remains we would get. So I found this on one of our site photographs. Clearly they wanted to reconstruct Woodhenge on a site near Market Harborough. But you can see it's not even to scale. It's not even at the right scale, but no, it's an excellent effort, I think. And that sort of marks the end of the sort of the less good evidence, shall we say. Going into what I call the sort of later Bronze Age, early Iron Age. Don't worry about the left-hand plan, that doesn't really work on this screen. But these archaeological plans show lines of pits that we found on 3 different sites: Manor Farm, Airfield Farm, and Leicester Road, Uppingham. And unsurprisingly, these lines of pits are called pit alignments. by archaeologists. And there's quite a lot in Leicestershire. I mean, I think that there's at least 25 that have had some kind of investigation. We're lucky enough to have done open area excavations over 3 of them. And they're quite curious things. The pits are, let's look at a picture of them. Leicestershire, there'll be a theme with this. Leicestershire never seems to be very kind to us weather-wise, partly because of the blooming clay as well. So this is the best photograph we could get of one of those pit alignments. So you can see a partly dug pit there, partly dug pit there, a pit here that hasn't been dug, another one right in the foreground. So I'm afraid I'm going to cheat and show you that photograph that I mentioned at the very start of pit alignments in Bedfordshire. So this is a sort of similar thing. It is, as it says, a line of pits that has been dug out. Although we didn't get any dating evidence from Airfield Farm, the radiocarbon dates from Manor Farm suggest that they were dug towards the end of the late Bronze Age. At Uppingham, the site there, from the pottery we were getting from the fields, it looked as they were being infilled by the middle Iron Age. But we know that some of them continued to be visible in the landscape for much longer, possibly even into the Roman period, which I'll mention later. The curious things with the Manor Farm, there's a couple of curious things with them. The Manor Farm actually has genuinely gaps in the pit alignment. So we did an open air excavation and there were no pits. The pits came down from the north, then there was a gap. Then they started again for a bit, then there was a gap. Then they continued again and continued southwards to a site that Albion Archaeology investigated at Lebanon Hill. So that's quite unusual to have gaps. This gap roughly coincided with where there seemed to be a paleo channel. So maybe whatever the purpose of these pits, they didn't need to dig it through that. Maybe, complete speculation, maybe that area at the time was still wooded and it didn't seem worth taking out trees to dig the pit alignment. The other thing that both of these have is that they're not quite sinuous, but you can see there's alignments in there. So on Manor Farm, you can see there's a straight alignment there, then it slightly changes angle and there's another alignment, then it slightly changes angle and there's another alignment. And there's just a hint of that also on this one at Uppingham. And those alignments are sort of curious. You wonder whether it's gang working, whether that's the stretch they built in that month, and then they did another one in another month. We can't really say. Now I think the next image isn't a world exclusive, but it's the first of the reconstruction drawings. Yes, it is. So very kindly, one of my former colleagues, Cecily Marshall, does, in her own time, some reconstruction drawings. And I think reconstruction drawings, archaeologists will always pick pieces with them because we want them to be right and we all have different opinions. But what they do is try and bring those plans that I show you to life a bit. So this is, as you can tell, a pit alignment. It's a line of people digging pits. It tries to show that they're slightly at different angles. The pits are quite big. They're maybe 2 meters in diameter and 1 meter deep. What we don't know about pit alignments, which I'll mention in a little bit, is why people would dig pit alignments. We don't know, for example, that they were all dug in one go, as this reconstruction tries to show. We don't know that there was a bank on one side. There may have been a bank on both sides. We certainly don't know there's a man in red swimming trunks directing the operations. We don't know that. It might have been a woman. We don't know. But what they do is they just bring it more to life. And pit alignments are speculated about, they didn't contain posts. That's often a suggestion that people make. They're just too big. There's no evidence for the post setting. And one of the ideas when they were first being investigated was because they seemed to be very early land divisions, maybe out of respect for the fact that they're the earliest land divisions, they didn't want to dig a continuous ditch. But then there are sites, like I showed you at Market, at Manor Farm, where there does seem to be a gully of some kind that predates the pit alignment. And at Biddingham Loop in Bedfordshire, we had a whole field system that predated the pit alignment. So it doesn't seem to be that. Another suggestion is maybe they're to mark out communal land, something like that. And it's true that, I didn't point it out, but the ones we excavated at Market Harborough, they are parallel with a stream. So you could imagine that there's good pasture land next to that stream. So maybe they're communal. Other people speculate that they're a bit like some of the monuments that were dug in the Neolithic and early Bronze Age. And it's shameful in a sense how many pits archaeologists dig. It's not shameful, it's just the way it is. And we're still not sure what their real function is. So I'll move on to things that we're much clearer about, which is ditches. So these plans show sort of quite extensive ditches that we've found. And these seem from the pottery to be slightly later in date. These are more into the Iron Age. And it seems much more sensible to us nowadays to dig a ditch. And at Magna Park, this one's sort of 300 meters long. At Sileby, it was sort of 400 meters long, dating to the Iron Age, going across the landscape. And this is quite a common theme, especially in the East Midlands, where you've got these extensive boundaries going across. And another common theme is that they will be another one there at Sileby, and then there's a little one there at Magna Park. And these boundaries, you know, they go across the landscape, whether they're sort of tribal boundaries, whether they're serving a similar function to pit alignments, we don't know. But they do continue in the landscape for some time. For example, the one at Sileby still was in use as a trackway into the Roman period. And that's quite common, that things don't just disappear, they continue to be used. There's a picture on the left of what it's like digging in Leicestershire. People from ULAS will know this very well. Any volunteers in the room will know that. The clay just makes the water just stay there. So that's the excavation area at Selby. Fortunately, we got a plan done before it did that to it. And this is the plan on this side. And it's one of these small enclosures. It's only sort of 25, 30 meters in diameter. The ditch is absolutely quite big. It's sort of 2.5 meters wide and over a meter deep. So it's really quite a substantial ditch, given it seems to contain only one roundhouse. No evidence for an entrance. And these sort of enclosures are quite common, and they're quite common attached to trackways, all these sort of extensive boundaries. This is the other one I mentioned at Magna Park. So this boundary continues off for another sort of 300 meters, and attached to it is a small enclosure here. And in this case, the evidence for the roundhouses, these round features, to the outside of the enclosure. And this is the site that members of the Leicestershire field workers came and volunteered on for a few days. And they seem to get nice weather. We need to invite them back more, I think. So they're tiny little Iron Age settlements with the enclosure. We've excavated some quite extensive ones. There's some known in the north of Leicester. There's some known throughout the Midlands. So this is in my sort of language, this is sort of 3 hectares in extent. It's quite big. It may even be bigger because there was an excavation in advance of the Innovation Centre at Market Harborough, and that found more Iron Age features. And the main components are this area where there's a sequence of ditched enclosures, then this area which is largely unenclosed but does have these evidence for roundhouses. These are sort of the drainage gully around houses plus a few enclosures. And then and then the thing to say is that these are actually located next to another extensive boundary, ditch boundary, that sort of predates them, running along the top there. World exclusive coming up. This is one of the reconstructions never seen before outside of this room in Leicestershire and whoever's online. So this is another one of Cecily's reconstructions. It's from a slightly different angle. I won't go back, but this is the extensive boundary that I mentioned. In the background, these are the enclosures that I showed you. And then this area is all sort of what you could call open settlement. And what this reconstruction tries to do is that there were clustering in the roundhouses. There's a sort of group there, there's a group there, another group here, and another group here, and another group here. So it could be quite a large sort of village type settlement, but unfortunately dating during this period of the Iron Age isn't that good. So the other possibility is that we've actually got a sort of a shift in landscape, in that the settlement is shifting across the landscape. Maybe it started here, then it moved there, then it moved here, then it moved there. And it's a shame at the moment we don't think we're going to be able to say what the situation is. The pottery doesn't give us close enough dating, and there isn't enough secure material for us to do extensive radiocarbon dating. And this is a sort of very common feature of these extensive Iron Age settlements. This is another Iron Age settlement, slightly different in character. This is at Manor Farm, and this is the former line of the pit alignment that's been redug as a ditch and then had enclosures attached to it. And in this case, again, slightly open in a sense. You've got the main area of Iron Age settlement down here, enclosures going up to the north. And this is a sort of reconstruction. So you've got the enclosures here, and that's following the line of the pit alignment. The pit alignment does stop at a sort of stream or paleo channel coming through there. And then you've got these small pockets of possibly small farmsteads. We can't say whether they're all in use at the same time. The caveat, as I tried to explain earlier, is always there. We base it on the archaeological evidence, but we have to go a little bit further than the archaeological evidence, or it would be very dull. So the position of these trees, we can't say what's going on in the paddocks and things, whether there are animals, whether there's crop being grown, we can't say. It's just trying to give an impression of what we think is going on. And I find them extremely useful to do, because it does make you think, rather than just look at a plan and photographs of red and white poles. It makes you really try and think about how it may work as a sort of landscape. Right, asterisks. Always important in any talk that covers the Iron Age or late Iron Age to mention asterisks. I've only really put it in there because it's a pretty picture. And the one thing that asterisks got right, as hopefully you've picked up on, is that at this time, lots of people were living in roundhouses. So there's a little collection of roundhouses in Asterix's village. And roundhouses were the most common type of building in the Iron Age. They don't look very impressive though. This is an Iron Age roundhouse at Overstone Park. I should stress again that we haven't found structural evidence here. We haven't got post holes or evidence of the wall. What we think we've got is the sort of drainage gully around the outside of a circular building. One of the advantages of the rain is that actually it makes them show up just slightly better. So here you can see a roundhouse at Manor Farm where the excavated segments, lovingly dug out and recorded, have just filled up with water in the rain. And this is the entranceway into the roundhouse. And then this one, we do have two porch post holes, one there and one there. But you can see the roundhouse shows up much better in the rain, I think. It's not pleasant to work on, but it shows up better. Other types of structures in the Iron Age, the classic is a sort of four-post structure. Guess what? It's because it's got four posts. So there's four posts, and it's about 2 meters square, this one, which is fairly typical size. And compared to some of the sites we've done in Northamptonshire and Bedfordshire, we haven't got as many four-post structures as we might expect. And you might think, oh, well, modern ploughing's destroyed it, but you can see that these post holes are quite substantial. So if there'd been other structures on those sites, they would have survived. And then this sort of links into whether the farmers are more doing cereal cultivation or whether they're more doing animal husbandry. Because one of the interpretations of these four-post structures is granaries. This isn't based on one from Leicestershire. And it's the usual. It's just trying to give you an indication of what those structures may have looked like. I've realised I need to keep an eye on the time. Right, Romans. So I always put in this picture just to say, yeah, the Romans came 43 AD. we've not really got any evidence for dramatic changes on any of the sites that we've worked on. I mean, obviously there are military sites, but those settlements that existed before the Roman conquest seem to have continued in use after the Roman conquest. We have got some of the settlements like Great Glen and Airfield Farm. They seem to be maybe 50 years or so after the Roman conquest. There were new settlements established in a different location from the Iron Age ones, but generally it's a picture of continuity. I'll mention that towards the end, there are a few unusual objects that have a sort of vague association with the military, but we found no evidence for sort of invasion, war, anything like that. Geophysics is fabulous for Iron Age and especially Roman sites, because it shows them up so well, because they like digging ditches. So at Manor Farm, you can see these darker marks are basically where there were ditches dug to define enclosures. It's a bit complex at Manor Farm because that's built on top of the Iron Age settlement. It's just continued in use. And the only way you can understand what's going on is from open air excavation. And at Great Glen, that's a sort of Roman farmstead, but it's gone through at least 2 major changes in layout. So in terms of geophysics, you can guess it's a Roman farmstead, but knowing which ditch came before another ditch, you can't say until you go to open air excavation, which of course is what we did. So this is back to the photograph, probably exactly the same one. There's still a little yellow archaeologist there next to a big yellow machine. And Great Glen is certainly the nearest farmstead that we've excavated to Roman Leicester. I should say on this plan, obviously, or not obviously, but this is showing the size of modern Leicester rather than the size of Roman Leicester. Roman Leicester's considerably smaller. So Great Glen is, people would know better than me, maybe 5 miles outside of the Roman city. It's close to the Gartree Road, which I think you had a talk about a couple of months ago. And the Gartree Road, it's maybe a mile from the Gartree Road. And it's basically a small farmstead. It has been published by me and colleagues in an Albion monograph. But unfortunately, the fines haven't gone to the county stores yet, but they will soon, I promise, somehow they will. So I was just going to briefly just run through. So this is sort of the plan of all those features, ignoring furrows removed. And the job during analysis is to use the pottery and other finds to try and determine what the sequence is. So this is the first layout of the settlement with roundhouses shown in red. This is the next phase where clearly the alignment's broadly similar, but they've dug a lot more ditches and made it much more regular in shape. And then this is the final phase of the settlement. And on this settlement, we didn't find any evidence for, like I said, pre-conquest activity. The activity does seem to have started at the sort of mid-late 1st century, and then it runs through towards the late 4th century, but there's no evidence for sort of early Anglo-Saxon activity. Again, we had some nice reconstruction drawings that are in the monograph, if it's still available. And this just tries to put next to each other the site plan and the reconstruction. So you can see where we've made it up, where we've been completely honest, and where we just weren't sure. So that's the sort of layout. At this time, roundhouses were still in use. They still continued in use into the Roman period, despite what people like me were told at university 100 years ago. Roundhouses continued in use. There, I've said it out loud. There were small rectangular buildings as well. So that's the sort of first phase of activity. Then in this period, the sort of 2nd century and into the 3rd, there's a major layout change. There are still roundhouses in use and some possible rectangular buildings. And there's almost a sort of ladder system here of a network of boundaries and things, presumably linked to sort of animal husbandry, with animals being brought in and managed in some way. So quite extensive sort of ladder system here. And then in the final phase, that ladder system mainly goes out of use, but there's remnants of it still existing in terms of there's still a network of small enclosures. We didn't find any evidence for roundhouses continuing into this period, although there are some known elsewhere. And to be honest, the evidence for the sort of rectangular buildings like this is tentative, and I'll mention that briefly, possibly next. Oh no, not next. So Great Glen and Manor Farm, they sort of had an organic layout, sort of slightly curvilinear. But these two Roman farmsteads, this one at Sileby, out underneath the sports pitches, if anyone knows Sileby, where Sileby Town play, in fact. So this wasn't subject to anything other than evaluation, geophysical survey and trenching, wasn't subject to open air excavation. And you can see it's much more regular, rectangular in layout, and then slightly less clear, but a similar layout exists at Airfield Farm, where you've got a sort of rectangular layout of enclosures. And these are therefore very different to what went before. And it's probably because most of these were in areas that weren't occupied before, and therefore it was much easier to lay out new systems of enclosures rather than make do with the ones that had existed before. This just compares the two plans. So you can see they're much more rectangular and regular. The one at Sileby, there's a hint that it may have had a sort of Iron Age origin, in that there's one of these small square enclosures, but that was only trial trenched. It wasn't subject to open area. And then it does make us wonder whether some of the slightly more curvilinear enclosures we had at Airfield Farm might actually be earlier in date, but we're not sure. That's another reconstruction from Cecily, just trying to show that certainly with the Airfield Farm and the Sileby ones, it looks like a sort of enclosure system that's been established, been stamped onto the landscape. And then Cecily's very kindly, as us, tried to sort of show humps and bumps of the roundhouses in the background, just to show you that the Iron Age settlement was there, the Roman settlement is here. And then that's in marked contrast to the Manor Farm settlement, where it's a bit more higgledy-piggledy, a bit more curvilinear. And that's because it's established all the way from following this boundary, which followed the pit alignment. And also there was an Iron Age settlement there before that just continued in use. Very briefly, I'll just mention buildings. I've lost track of the time, so oh yes. So, as I said, roundhouses did continue into the Roman period. We had some at Great Glen. These are sort of the ground layout. Generally speaking, with roundhouses, the most popular direction for the doorway was sort of east facing, and people speculate about reasons for that. So roundhouses. Archaeologists have dug an awful lot of rural settlements, farmsteads, and we struggle to find sort of rectangular buildings that are so common in towns. And therefore, every time we find a sort of strange collection, like here of post holes or gullies, we speculate whether that could be somehow related to a rectangular building. And I'm quite bad at this, because you walk across a site, you can see that there's like 20, 30 kilograms of Roman pottery, animal bone. You know people were living there, but we don't find evidence for the actual building. So we desperately try and look for any hint where there could be a rectangular building. And we might be wrong, but we might not. So this plan just tries to show sort of possible places within Great Glen where there might be rectangular buildings based on gullies or concentrations of post holes. And there are other sites where there's sort of concentrations. You know, you can't make out the actual layout of a rectangular building at some of these, but you just can't help but feel there has to have been a rectangular building. And then two at the bottom that are much sort of clearer, easier to accept examples. And we know from plenty of work elsewhere in the country that some rectangular buildings don't actually have earth-fast foundations. They're just resting on stone pads or even resting on the ground. So in some ways, it's not a surprise, but it is a struggle. But we did find one decent, as I'd call it, Roman building at Airfield Farm, an aisle building. So this had massive post holes with post pipes, sort of 30 centimeters in diameter. And this is a sort of type of building, as I said, known as an aisle barn, aisle building. And there's one very similar that was found at Whitwell, very similar dimensions, almost similar in terms of the alignment. And these are a variety of functions they would have served. Some of them maybe were basically barn, granaries, storage things. Some of them developed into buildings. The reconstruction I'll show you is one that we excavated in Bedfordshire. And the main feature is that you've got these massive posts that support the roof. Because they're so massive, the suggestion is that there might be an upper story, and that might be used for storage, grain and everything else. Whereas down below, it's more of an agricultural barn, but many of them had a sort of domestic area that was converted at one end. Now, unfortunately, at Airfield Farm, we didn't have that end. We didn't have any evidence of tiled roofs. We didn't have any evidence of heated buildings, but it's quite possible that there were rooms within the aisle building at Airfield Farm, and that's where people were living. Just thought I'd mention a couple of strange features for people who are interested in features. So at Great Glen, we had a very sort of distinct area of cobbles, really, a neat patch. They only occurred in that area. This is the plan of them. And they're quite similar to some features that we've had in Bedfordshire in terms of the size and shape. But in Bedfordshire, we've had them made out of limestone because that's quite common. And at Great Glen, it's just the sort of more locally available flint cobbles. And it's speculated whether they might be freshing floors linked to sort of crop processing. If it's wet or unpleasant, you want to have a hard surface to be freshing on. And therefore it's possible, because these weren't extensive, it wasn't like a yard that went on for, 5-10 meters. It's only sort of 3-4 meters in diameter. It's possible that that's a threshing yard, which does support the child plant remain evidence that arable cultivation was a part of the economy of these farmsteads. Now, these little features, people in the room maybe can't make them out, but I'd like to call them cute little ring ditches, which is exactly what they are. They're tiny. So they're a little bit like they're like the roundhouses, but absolutely diddy. Now, I don't think they're roundhouses for pets. I don't think they're roundhouses for children. I'd hope not. They're only sort of 2, 3, 4 meters in diameter. The ones we've had at Manor Farm were quite circular. The one we had at Great Glen was much more sort of oval in shape. And there are others that are known in Leicestershire at Rearsbury. And then there's quite a few that are known in the Thames Valley. And people speculate about them because we can't really say their function. We had a central post in the one at Great Glen, as they did at Rearsbury. In the Thames Valley, these tend to be interpreted as a simple thing like a haystack, something like that. And then you've got a drainage area around it, so linked to sort of animals. But Rearsbury, I think it was interpreted more on the sort of ritual funeral side. But in truth, until we get one that has really good preservation and a bit more information, it's difficult to say what they could be. They seem too neat almost to be just associated with a haystack, something like that, although I guess it's not impossible. Anyway, cute ring ditches. This is a shout out to all the environmental archaeologists in the room and at home, just that we don't just dig up features. We don't just find pottery and metal that I'll show you in a sec. We obviously collect a lot of animal bone, and that tells us a bit about the animals that were being kept at the time. The preservation on the sites that we've done in Leicestershire is very variable, and the best preservation we've had is at Great Glen. And the Great Glen assemblage is sort of interesting because it's comparable to some of the stuff that's been examined in Roman Leicester itself. The charred remains, the seeds and things obviously tell us about the sort of different crops that are being grown. And then more rarely we get waterlogged plant remains. This is my shout out to finds, but we do have a finds display at the end of the room with people that probably know far more than me about finds. At Great Glen, we had a sort of a mixed assemblage of metalwork, a little bit of everything. There were maybe 25 Roman coins, maybe something like 8 or 9 brooches. There's a few bits of jewelry like this bracelet. This bit of a horse harness is quite unusual because the nearest comparison we can find is at the Roman legionary site at Caerleon in South Wales. So that's a nice little comparison. So there's a hint that that object, doesn't mean to say there was someone military on the site, of course. It might be just something someone's bought secondhand, but it's sort of interesting. And then also at Great Glen, which as far as we could tell was a sort of a farmstead. We didn't find these, unfortunately. We found the very tips of some styli. So this end, which is basically the writing implement, they wrote in wax. And we found two fragments of styli at Great Glen, which suggests at the very least that someone was on that site who could write. That's at the very least. We can't say whether it was one of the occupants of the farmstead. It might have been someone who was visiting, doing tax collections or something like that. But it's an interesting find to get on a farmstead. And then at Manor Farm, we had hardly any coins. We did have some brooches, but we actually had this sort of, the bottom of a sort of sword sheath thing, the very base of it, which again hints at sort of whether it's military or just fighting. But it's an interesting object. And a lot of sort of rural farmsteads that there is evidence now for sort of some kind of association with military finds. But what we don't know is whether that's people buying the objects secondhand, people who once served in the army, then living on those farmsteads, or something more. We don't know. People. We haven't seen the picture of Roman Leicester, but just to reassure you, we are coming towards the end. Don't worry. People. So Albion, we had that Middle Bronze Age cremation at Manor Farm. We had no burials at Great Glen, even though the farmsteads may be a hectare in size, quite big. Airfield Farm, we had no Iron Age or Roman burials, and the same at Manor Farm, we had no burials. But at this site, Overstone Park, on the southeast edge of Market Harborough, we did finally find evidence of the people that were digging those ditches, that were wearing those brooches, that were using those coins. So this is a shout out to them. This one can't make it out, but they're buried with a complete pottery vessel up near the head. This one is one of those unusual ones in that the head isn't there. The head is positioned down here. It's a sort of what we, in archaeology terms, we call a decapitation burial. There's no evidence that it was the cause of death, as far as we know, but the analysis is still to be undertaken. These are actually, they're not common, but they're not unusual types of burial. What's interesting with this one is this is sort of a large stone, and you do wonder whether the head may have been moved and the stone placed in the position the head was, but that's just speculation. And there are sites that I know in Bedfordshire where there's cemeteries where 10% of the burials are decapitation. So it's difficult. When I was at university, people would say decapitation, you'd think, oh, criminals, all that sort of thing. But it doesn't seem to be that. They're buried respectfully. And the idea is maybe it's to help them go to the afterlife or something like that. But it's not the cause of death. It's something that happened after death. And then this is another reconstruction by Cecily, just trying to actually bring the people to life that like us, they lived and they died. And this is a Roman cemetery that we excavated in Northamptonshire, Burton Latimer. Right, now I think I am coming towards the end. And what I'm sort of tried to do, at least for the Roman period, is to sort of do a shout out that rural settlements are just as interesting as the big insulas of the cities, sort of thing. The amount of evidence that we're getting because of the scale of development in the countryside for the Roman and the Iron Age and earlier countryside is quite extensive, and something that's difficult to achieve in a city like Leicester, where you can only do smaller area excavations. So this sort of tries to put together, to the west of Market Harborough, 3 or 4 of the main excavations that have been undertaken. This is our airfield farm site, Manor Farm. This is Lebanon Hill that was undertaken by Albion Archaeology. And up here, there's a site under the Innovation Centre that was undertaken by Mola. And that's quite a big extent of a sort of archaeological landscape. We know within there was a pit alignment that was dug in the late Bronze Age. We know that pit alignment continued in use, but was changed to a ditch, a boundary. And then next to that boundary, an Iron Age settlement built up. And then we know that going into the Roman period, there were at least 3 Roman settlements in that area. And this is just trying to show those Roman settlements. That's that regular one that I talked about at Airfield Farm. And that seems to have continued into the sort of 3rd, 4th century. The one at Manor Farm does seem to have finished earlier. It seems to have stopped in the sort of middle 2nd century, as far as we can tell. And then Lebanon Hill is being looked at by Albion Archaeology, but I think the report I saw said that that also continued into the sort of towards the end of the Roman period. And just to give you an idea of the scale and the clue that I'm coming towards the end, although I do ramble on at the end, is Roman Leicester. This should be at the same scale, if I've got it right, just to show you the scale of the defended part, of course, only the defended part of Roman Leicester, and the scale of the investigations, for example, in the landscape to the west of Market Harborough. So you can see these sort of individual farmsteads are kind of the size of an insula of the Roman city, which is quite interesting, I think. So in summary, Albion has been very fortunate to undertake half a dozen excavations with significant discoveries, I'd say. Overplayed it. It's not very exciting, but it does fit the sort of wider pattern of non-monument evidence of those periods. As in elsewhere in the East Midlands, there is evidence now for increased sort of land division, maybe from our sites from the Middle Bronze Age, but definitely from the Late Bronze Age with extensive pit alignments and ditch boundaries going into the early Iron Age. The numerous sort of Iron Age and Roman settlements that we've investigated, I think provide a useful reminder that most people at this time were farmers and lived in the countryside. Now, I don't finish there because I now run through a whole series of acknowledgements for another hour. Is that all right? No. So briefly, there's me stood here, but obviously the work that goes on these projects is enormous. So even for something like Great Glen, this is sort of the list of people that get credited in the actual publication because they've written part of it, or they've drawn pictures, or they've taken photographs. Over here is the list of the field archaeologists that have been involved. And then, of course, there's the residents. When we did Great Glen, it wasn't a popular development. We were driving in our muddy boots, in our muddy vehicles through the village. And actually people initially were a bit hostile, but I think they warmed to us. So there's always the sort of local community aspect that you never want to forget. But the field team is one, you've seen the sort of some of the photographs, and I could have shown you a lot worse, just trying to show the sort of weather conditions that people work in. So this is just the team that was at Great Glen. I'm not going to do this for all the excavations, but it's kind of a shout out to the field team. And then we do have a volunteer metal detectorist who comes on our site and a surveyor. this, I think, kind of sums up some days on site. I'm lucky enough to go to site when there are meetings, and hopefully I've looked at the weather forecast and know what it's going to do. But that is not at all atypical for either Albion, ULAS, or any commercial unit. You're out there in these conditions. It's wet and it's lonely. Unlike when somehow Leicestershire field workers came to our site at Magna Park, where you can see it's lovely and dry. But that was a fun experience. With all of these things, volunteering on site, open days, it has to be done with the permission of the client and the consultant, and it has to be, you know, the right site. So for here, to be honest, we were probably a year in advance of the development, so it was quite a safe site to come onto. The site at Airfield Farm, a complete no-no. We were in the middle of a building development. It wouldn't have been possible to have volunteers or, unfortunately, open days. We were lucky to have open days at Great Glen. So lots of people from the village and from the local schools came. At Magna Park, we actually had some open days too. That's actually me, in fact, showing people round. And really, you know, if we don't have the interest in archaeology, then you wonder why we're doing it. But we do have the interest in archaeology based on the attendance at these open days. That is a well-known archaeologist in Leicester, and the Leicestershire field workers. So that's where I'd like to finish, except to say, I've got you a reading list, okay? So this is the reading list that I'd like you to all read, learn, and send me questions about by the time I come back next. No, only joking, but just to say that they're the main sites. Where we can, we've always put at the very least a summary in the transactions, and that's sort of just acknowledging that. Where it goes to, where it's a bigger sort of piece of work like Great Glen, it will come out as its own sort of monograph. That's where I'd like to finish. Thank you very much. Thank you.